Hello, movie lovers. Welcome home. My name is Amy Henserling, and you are listening to Watch This List. Today is a very special day because I am beginning a brand new series. As She Said has wrapped up now for the time being. I was thinking about doing something that focused exclusively on directors, since a lot of us on Letterboxd, I feel the further we get into cinephilia, the more our choices depend on who the director is. And we sort of get very director centric, I've noticed. So I wanted to do something that was a little bit of an edge because I am not a person who normally watches edgy films. So I came up with the name Provocateur and then realized that I could put auteur in provocateur. So it is Provocateur, which I feel like should be said in a French accent. Provocateur. So Jacob is my first guest, Bodavra, because he is so insightful, and I knew that he would choose someone that would sort of qualify. Initially, I was going to do it doesn't have to be a provocative director, but more like provocative films. But John Huston qualifies for both, I feel. He's both a provocateur and has provocative films. Wouldn't you say, Jacob?
Yeah, I it certainly turned out that way in the movies that we picked, I think. I didn't think when we first started talking, I don't think of John Huston. I guess provocative is sort of adjacent to like controversial. And I don't really think of him in that way. He, he's also a director that, like someone like Robert Wise or Richard Fleischer or something like that, who kind of, I think, is seen as a straightforward craftsman, but who kind of jumps in between different genres, and is respected, but not necessarily seen as an auteur. That word, I guess, I associate with people who have a very kind of identifiable visual style. Or
like Wes Anderson or Kubrick or Tarantino even.
Yeah.
Where you can tell right away. You're right. That's a good point.
And whereas, the things the people I just mentioned do are so different that it almost doesn't seem like the right word. But then when you look at the filmography, there's certainly a sensibility that unifies the films, I think, or certain films, and phases of that filmography. But at every kind of remove of those changes, there is something provocative in Huston's work, I think, that often has to do with, and this is sort of how we ended up choosing these films, I think, has to do with his relationship to literature and adapting literary works, is just sort of inherently provocative, I think.
And I think I'm thinking of the word more, not necessarily as like controversial or misunderstood, more like eliciting strong reactions or strong emotions, like provoking, but not necessarily in like a, what is the guy's name who did Irreversible? Gaspar Noé.
Yeah, that's right.
Or Leo Corot or whatever, where it's like they're trying to get an intense reaction from you. I see this as more, maybe Huston is just like a more vanilla version of someone that would be very incendiary or make you uncomfortable. But that's what I'm kind of going for, I think, is just that you react to him. You are like, I don't know, especially with Wise Blood, you kind of are like...
Right. I mean, so many of the scenes in that are just poking a stick at so many so many middle class American sensibilities, so many kind of attitudes of propriety. I mean, that scene, I just kind of threw it on this morning as I was drinking coffee, in that scene where, the daughter of the blind preacher, whose name I'm forgetting, has the shrunken body, and her head is kind of and she's like the Virgin Mary, and opens the door and wants to be called mother, and you're just like, this is, my grandmother would not like this. And so much of that movie fits into that kind of description, just moves that are, yeah, maybe less controversial and more just sort of um, more provocative. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we have like the spectrum is over here we have like things that will gross you out, and over here we have my grandmother wouldn't watch this. So
Yeah.
it's somewhere in between maybe those two. Uh,
Thematic
the,
provocation.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it, actually, because this is a little bit, in process. I get visions for the next thing, but kind of have to feel it out and hone it out. The more guests I have, and then it's like, oh, okay, we've got like a block of marble right now for this thing,
Yeah.
and we're just kind of chipping away to see. But I think that Huston is a good first pick because it's not like having Michael Mann or Ridley Scott, where they have movies that perhaps are more that way, but they aren't themselves sort of rogue or mavericks. I feel like Huston is such a powerhouse in that way. He's very
Yeah.
brave.
I agree with that. Yeah. I think when we were kind of exchanging emails discussing this before we watched the movies, I had just seen his adaptation of the Bible,
Right.
and which is just as part of what's interesting about that movie is just imagining him, walking into whatever studio it was with this concept or with this, I kept thinking about it as I was watching it, just like, how was this made? It's a Dino De Laurentiis production.
Right.
And just imagining going for that, like, it's the first 22 chapters of Genesis. We're going to make a movie, of that. And just, the willingness to do that. And, despite, I think, probably understanding that this is going to be something that isn't quite going to work, but we're going to do it anyway. All that is fascinating about him. I think there's just even in his movies that I've seen that I didn't like as much, there's just kind of a gravitas to the choices, that he makes, and that always is compelling, even if the Bible does not really work as a movie, I don't think that's a surprise, but it's, even so, I felt it was worth seeing, for that. There's a scene I told you about in an email where Huston is, of course, the voice of God in the film. And
true
right,
auteur right there.
right. The movie starts with him literally over just kind of expressionistic color on the screen saying, "In the beginning," in that voice of his. And then later he plays Noah himself. And so there's a scene where he as the voice of God narrator is saying Noah, and then he on screen as Noah is looking up and looking scared. And that was the moment where I was just like, John Huston has to be the coolest guy ever, just what a lunatic to have somehow pulled this off. You could sort of imagine him on set, drinking whiskey as he was wont to do, as I was reading about him preparing for this, his, his consumption was sort of legendary. So including that story about he and Bogart on the set of, The African Queen. Have you heard that story?
No, tell me.
That everybody involved in the production got very sick with dysentery or with some kind of intestinal parasites, but he and Bogart were fine because they weren't drinking any water. They were just drinking whiskey the whole time, so they were fine.
Yeah. It reminds me of like stories about Peckinpah.
Yeah,
where the dude just drank so much. It's so fascinating to me that they could pull off such artistry under those conditions.
right.
Or like I just was talking about Bad Lieutenant and Ferrera saying that they were all snorting cocaine on set, and it's like that one at least you can tell.
Absolutely.
But still, to be able to have any sort of coherency in the narrative and in the filmmaking is pretty amazing,
Yeah.
uh, considering. But yeah, that
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. It seems like a very sort of a, to take it back to the concept here, a kind of a literary thing too. This sort of image of the Faulkner, the Hemingway,
Hemingway.
the writer with the bottle of bourbon on the desk. It seems clear that as we have kind of thought through this idea, maybe Huston thought of himself that way. That
Mm-hmm.
he wrote a film with Capote, which you could speak to. I haven't seen it, but your write up on that was great. Um, and Moby Dick was adapted with Ray Bradbury.
Uh-huh.
um, that uh, he was a writer as well as a director, and maybe sees those things as maybe not all that different.
Well, and even like, when I think of like the Lowry, Under the Volcano is
Yeah,
it's so literary. And then what was I just thinking of? Well, Night of the Iguana, Tennessee Williams. So he,
right.
you know what? It's kind of interesting. I wonder if he really truly just wanted to be a writer and then just ended up, adapting these things because the richness of that was such an integral part of it. Like
Yeah,
all of his movies are, except for maybe Annie, I don't know, are pretty profoundly, the dialogue is just snappy and catchy and grown up. Maltese Falcon, Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
yeah.
Um, he's just got an elevated style, in the script wise, and so the visuals are almost secondary. I feel to that passion.
This was, yeah. I think that's really well said. That was sort of my, I think, conclusion, or thesis, I guess, about his relationship to literature, is that what seems kind of provocative about it is that he has the willingness to just take these stories as written and say, I'm not going to try to change it to make it a better film. I'm just going to be as faithful as possible, which I think conventional wisdom would say is not the right approach to adapting something. You have to, if you're going to translate something, you have to consider the thing it's going to be translated into as being more important than the source material or whatever. But his approach seems to be, no, I'm just going to, those Wise Blood is almost, scene for scene, just those stories, which was, Flannery O'Connor took several short stories and kind of fused them together to write that book. And it's pretty much just that story. There are a few changes, of course, but um, he, to me, that's the very provocative thing in his approach to adapting those pieces of literature, is just that he really wants them to stay as they are.
Just like, I mean, I think that probably, I haven't read it, but everybody was commenting about this. The Dead is probably the prime example of that, where it's like he hardly changed anything. It's not really a cinematic story,
No,
um, at all.
no,
I don't think. But he just doesn't care. Like you're saying, he is the words and the writing. It just seems to just like ooze from him to such an extent that that factor just doesn't seem to interfere at all. The fact that, we're literally at a dinner party and then the climax is the last 10 minutes and then it's over, but you have this gorgeous, epilogue, and it just hits you, and it's amazing, but I don't know that anybody else could do that or would do that.
no, no. And it and this that film was interesting. We both saw it for the first time pretty
Yeah.
recently. And I read it right before I watched it. I hadn't read that story in years. I remember reading it in college, and um, but it had been a while, and it is almost exactly the same. There's just this periodic voiceover, not voiceover, but inner monologue that we read in the story from the character Gabriel, that the film, doesn't make clear that he's the sort of focus of, because it doesn't do that. It just sort of roves around this party, and we see these kind of interactions that feel, I think, if you don't know where it's going, feel sort of inconsequential or maybe even uninteresting. It's just these sort of people having kind of sometimes political conversations, and you see the attempt to be polite kind of overwhelm that. That religion comes up and they say, let's not talk about this. Politics come up and they say, oh, let's not talk about this. Let's make sure that the drunk stays on his best behavior. Those are the things that you're sort of, I don't know, was that your experience of?
Yeah, or it's like past the port. I mean, it's either that they're trying to like keep everybody else entertained,
right?
But they also sing, and like it's so artistic. It's so
right.
artsy. They sing. The guy reads this poem.
Right.
So even in the literary adaptation, there's literary material
right.
happening. So I mean, Huston's like an English major to just like the embodiment of an English major.
Yeah, that's well said. Because even in the when he recites that poem, it's like the movie just stops and we are there listening to this, and you're sort of even struggling a little bit to analyze or to decipher as the people there are, and then it ends, and I think the first thing that Aunt Julia or Aunt Kate, I forget who it is, just says is, well, that was very strange, that
what are we doing?
Yeah. And that's sort of exactly what, it almost comes as a relief, because that's how you're feeling too.
Right.
You're like, what was this? What was this meant to signify in the story? And that's an interesting element of that film, I think, too. The songs, just, somebody sings a song and we just listen, that's
right.
That's
or
it.
She did the real, like, I guess the beginning of the climax is her stopping on the staircase.
Yeah.
And hearing the tenor. And I like when directors are so confident and so clear on what gives them pleasure, that they don't really care to draw things out, or that you're sitting there going, what is this? He comes across as definitely wanting to convey something specific, but then there is this I don't give a shit energy that I really respect.
Yes.
Where he's just not going to explain it to you. I think he cares if we like it, but sort of not. I don't know. That's a really sweet spot balance that I think I'm very attracted to in directors, and it's usually a through line. If they didn't at the beginning of their career, then they don't at the end, because The Dead was the last one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it reminds me of Miles Davis, when he was on stage, would not address the audience. He would just play, and would not introduce the band or do any in between song banter with the crowd or anything like that. And to certain people, this is annoying or you're
off-putting.
Yeah, off-putting. But to me, that has always been great. And one of the things that makes Miles, like Huston's just sort of, this is the set list, this is what we're doing. And you as the audience have a role in kind of leaning into that and bringing your full self to that as well. In that, when that poem is being recited, if you're missing it, that's it. It sort of is like, well, that's on you, that you should, as all the people in that room, it's on them to be sitting and listening. And if you're not, then, you're going to miss it.
I'm reading a book right now by James Baldwin called The Devil Finds Work.
Yeah.
And it's all about the books that he loved as a kid and the films he loved. Mm-hmm. And he was comparing, the excerpt I read last night was about the difference between film and theater, and how theater is a lot like church in the sense that it's flesh and blood meeting flesh and blood. Whereas a movie, every time you watch it, you get these moments, it never changes, but every time you see a play live, you're seeing it for the first time that time, and that's the only time it'll be exactly what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this intimacy, I think, that happens in the theater that Baldwin was saying. It just doesn't happen with the movies.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what makes Huston special is that since they're literary, all of us who have read the material have a relationship already with it, like Wise Blood or Moby Dick. And then his adaptation is either changing that or expanding on it, or maybe even, it's a negative thing if you love the book and you're like, that wasn't any good. But still, it's this interesting intimacy, I think, even though the medium is static and it's fixed. I think that infusing James Joyce and Malcolm Lowry and Tennessee Williams allows for us to bring a nostalgia or a memory to it that otherwise isn't there if it's just brand new material.
That's super interesting. I think, yeah, I see that for sure. And that, even to go back to what Baldwin was saying, theater is thought to be literary, and I think cinema is not. But that and what you're saying is Huston makes cinema literary in this way, and I see that completely. I think that's true. And there still is that, that this is one of the, maybe the cliches of movies is, the book is always better. That just sort of attitude.
I know, right?
And I think, I'm not going to argue that Moby Dick the film is better than Herman Melville's novel. Right. Certainly, right. I don't believe that, and I'm not going to say that. But I think it's also true that, and this is part of my, my relationship to that movie. I saw that movie when I was a child. I saw that before I knew anything about John Huston or any of his other movies. I had never read Moby Dick or even knew the name Herman Melville, but something about that film made a profound impact on me that was, I think, literary. That sermon at the beginning with Orson Welles standing on the bridge of this remarkable ship pulpit, that sort of juts out over the, and which the mast is shaped like a crucifix. It's just this beautiful image. And he's, speaking about Noah, of course, but it's sort of an odd
Jonah.
Jonah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Jonah. No, it's okay.
And it's this sort of odd take on Jonah, I think. But just and it certainly went way over my head when I was a child, as the poem in The Dead maybe still does. But there was just something that seemed so significant about it. And that long, odd, it's just like suddenly you're at church in the middle of this kind of almost Godzilla movie about fighting a giant monster at sea. That was what I loved about it as a child. But even as a child, you notice that there's something kind of significant and poetic happening here in the movie too, that made a big impact on me. So, just to say that I think it's not necessarily about the one being better or worse than the other. That's just sort of not all that interesting of a conversation, I think, maybe, but that a film can at least do justice to a work as unfilmable as Moby Dick is, that it is possible to both hold that you can't really make Moby Dick into a film, and that this one is pretty good, which I feel that it is, and I'm very interested to hear about what you thought of Moby Dick. We shared kind of notes about it.
Oh yeah. Well, and I love stuff. I mean, obviously, since I believe in God and I see, so it's sort of an inescapable theme, right? Yeah. Like no matter what you're watching. I was just saying this the other day that even if you were an atheist or you're a person or an agnostic doesn't believe, there's just so much in every piece of art, and like it's kind of like you can't really get away from it. And Moby Dick is interesting in that sense because it's got so many religious overtones to it and metaphors, and he infuses that. I read chapter 9, which is the sermon.
Yeah.
Just specifically, it's so beautiful. That there's another poem in there, but it's so weighty, and it gives it, like you had said about Huston, this gravitas, and it feels more serious. Like, I just watched Fellowship of the Ring yesterday, and it's so I mean, obviously J.R.R. Tolkien was in with C.S. Lewis, so I mean, there's no question as to what he was thinking, but still putting in the sort of spirituality into it just makes things so much more. It seems like they have higher stakes, and that there's this supernatural terror that's involved. It's not just like man versus whale. It's like man versus self, but then the whale is God, or is, you know, that we're trying all the time to wrangle it, and we're just going to be swallowed whole when we do that. There's just so much. I mean, it's almost like it's a task to even comment on it, really, thematically.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I mean, and Moby Dick's interesting culturally because it's one of those stories I think almost any. Well, I don't know if this is true. Do you think this is true? It seems like you could survey Americans of a kind of adult age, and I would say most of them could maybe tell you what it was about. And they would say, I think,
that it's about a whale. Yeah.
A guy whose obsession, I think I don't know, I guess maybe I should say, I guess people with college educations, maybe that would be able, most of them I think would be able to say it's a book about, even if they've not read it, which most people have not, it's a book about a guy who's obsessed with this whale that hurt him, and his obsession with it destroys him, you know, which is, even, you know, and the book makes it clear that that's like a small kind of fraction of what of what it really is. But the film, I think, also does that. You know, there are so many other just odd parts of the story. This, you know, this curious world of the Pequod with its, you know, multicultural kind of assemblage of people, and but all of them men, you know, and living together in this strange kind of, you used the word when we were kind of discussing it beforehand, it's very cultish.
Yes.
The world of that, you know, ship in which they're translating bodies into cash, you know, they're harvesting these Leviathan that then they boil into something that they sell. You know, it's just, every part of it is sort of surreal and doesn't quite fit into that. I don't know. There are many parts that are difficult to reconcile with that simple thesis of the book being a story of obsession,
like a fanatical,
yeah,
right, like a captain who's just like just a purely vengeance story. I don't think that's what's going on here, ultimately. Like you've written about also like the whiteness factor, and like that's a really interesting point to me that I don't feel like I understand fully, but they do say it over and over and over, like, that it's a white whale. And then there's all these cultural implications, especially with Ishmael and the cannibal. What's the cannibal's name? It's
Queequeg.
Queequeg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, there's a great book by, we probably shouldn't get too far into it just for time purposes, but there, you know, there's a great book by,
this is our book club.
Yeah. Charles Olson, that the title is Call Me Ishmael. And the first chapter of that just summarizes the story of the Essex, which is the story that Moby Dick is based upon. It really happened that a whale sunk a whaling ship. But what's different in real life, what happened on the Essex, and there's a terrible movie by Ron Howard made about this called In the Heart of the Sea.
Oh, with Chris Hemsworth.
It's a terrible movie in my opinion, but the story of the Essex is interesting because what happened, so a whale sunk this whaling ship, and the surviving crew members cannibalized one another. And there were black sailors and white sailors, and they ate the black folk first. That was what happened on the
Whoa.
Essex, and some of them survived. And so the beginning of Charles Olson's book summarizes this story, and that this was a story told and would have been familiar to anybody involved in the whaling industry, as Herman Melville was, as kind of a, horror story. The people who survived were just living in that community. They survived having, consumed the flesh of these men that they sailed with. So Herman Melville, in the midst of the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, is writing this book. He's living in New York, and a law is being passed that, that essentially there's no such thing as freedom for a person called black in the United States at this time. And Moby Dick was at first a nonfiction book, because he's just writing a book about the whaling industry. But at some point revised it somewhat radically into the text that it became, which is just an unclassifiable work of literature. So it's so, there is this long chapter that a lot of people mention that's just called cetology. That's just about the biological zoological classifications of different types of whales. And so you could see, okay, that must be from when he had thought of this as a nonfiction book. And then there's just these strange, Ahab stomping around the deck, saying things to the sea. And, it at first it seems that Ishmael is our point of view character, and then he disappears for 300 pages, and we're just kind of totally unmoored, and all these sort of crazy things happen. But anyway, yes, that in the political context in which Melville was writing, slavery was the most significant feature of American life, and so that he wrote a book about a ghastly white thing that destroys the kind of microcosm of American society that we see on the Pequod, and drives them all insane. I kind of can't ignore that aspect
Right.
of it. It just seems,
Right.
it seems important. And you brought up Queequeg, at the beginning of the film, Ishmael is just driven to the sea and has this kind of curious bromance
Attraction almost.
Yeah. They
Right.
sleep in the bed together. They in the book, it's much more kind of
overt.
Yeah. He wakes up and Queequeg is kind of cuddling him as a lover, and they are linked, and they sort of, pledge an oath to one another at the beginning of the book. And, so there is this suggestion that Ishmael is a pilgrim abandoning his identity, on some level. He's which, and part of that is whiteness, in the film, Queequeg is, a Pacific Islander played by a German actor, which is, to contemporary sensibilities, awkward and racist,
Right.
But even so, and I'm not going to argue against that, label of racism, but I would say also that as it is that performance is a very uncanny kind of, we can tell that he's not really this island warrior. He's this kind of, it's an other kind of performance. And I don't know, something about that uncanniness, I think, does underline some of the, I think, Huston's maybe awareness of this feature of the story too. At the very beginning, go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to say that seems to be another through line for Huston, is that this embracing of misfits and the other and outcasts, and he seems to have besides the literary quality, such an affinity. I mean, he has a film called The Misfits, but
Right.
literally, I think there's this fondness for eccentricity or what is perceived as such. And so perhaps it may be a stretch, but I think that maybe there's more of an identification with Ishmael for him than there would be for Ahab. Ahab is kind of tertiary comparatively, I feel like, in the film. He definitely doesn't feel like the main character to me.
No.
Gregory Peck.
No. Yeah, and I don't think it. I think that's true of the book as well. That Ahab is, you're compelled by him certainly, but he doesn't seem like the character we're meant to identify with,
Right.
or that we're meant to see ourselves in.
If anything, I felt like Starbuck. That was
Sure.
that I think he's like the audience stand-in in the film.
Yeah.
Where he's the one that's like, is anybody seeing what's going on here? Like, we need to turn back. What are you doing? You're putting the crew. It's kind of like a run silent, run deep.
Yeah.
Where you're like, dude, this guy's just completely willing to let half the crew die.
Yeah.
Just so that he can get this destroyer. It's got that same Ahab energy. It's just that, he happens to be right or whatnot.
Right.
But it's still the same thing where it's like, this person is clearly maniacal and so single focused to where they can't take in reality anymore. But I don't think that that's what Huston's trying to highlight, because he's not really in it very much. It's so much more about the supporting characters and the vibe, like the atmosphere, so you feel like you're part of the crew and what it would feel like to be with them.
I agree with that so much. Yeah. I there's some scenes at the beginning of the movie where they're singing these shanties and just pulling on ropes and raising and I would, if that went on for 2 hours, I would be so happy. I love that stuff, all that kind of depiction of this very strange world that was, I think it's so significant. This was the American economy at this time, was that these kind of lunatics, voluntarily, and in some cases not, shipped on these wooden vessels for 2-3 years at a time, and went out into the abyss and killed these things that were the size of skyscrapers. The reality of that, I think we're sort of allowed to see. And even one of the monstrous things about the film, it depicts the killing of real whales. He filmed this in, I think, Spain, where it was still kind of done at this. In 1953, the film was made, and it's awful to see. Of course, to see these images, but it's also just a reminder of that kind of that piece of who we are as Americans, that we come from this, and it is ugly,
right.
There's something very provocative about that aspect of Moby Dick, the film, I think.
For sure. I was going to say, it's kind of like, I don't know if you ever saw the film Wake in Fright.
No.
Okay. Where there's actually like a kangaroo killing, and it really happened. And they were saying, oh, we just used footage from when, it wasn't that they made it happen for the film. Right. It's that it happened, and they, but whatever the case is, those sorts of things are extremely uncomfortable, and it hits you in a different way. Because obviously films, we all sort of implicitly accept that they're fake.
Yeah.
But when you put in, I think this is why documentaries are so effective. When you put in things that have reality to them, it's just very different. And so I did know that going into Moby Dick, that we were watching, we're not watching like CGI. Um,
Yeah.
and it does sort of in Wake and Fright as well, where you're like, humanity is awful and we're murderers, and
Yeah.
there's this sort of depth of almost like guilt or conviction just as a species that you feel. It's not just like I don't feel bad for Amy, but it's like
Hmm.
humanity is darkened, and I don't know, well,
Yeah.
capable.
Yeah. And even, that kind of reminds me of what you just said about Starbuck being our kind of most familiar, maybe, sensibility in the film. It's him at the end when, Ahab has been killed. There's this kind of insane Shakespearean moment where he's atop the whale,
Mm-hmm.
from hell's heart, I stab at thee. This whole incredible, poetic monologue that kills him. And he then is sort of fixed to the whale and waving them on, from beyond. And it sort of seems as if they're just all too stunned by this to really do anything about it. But it's Starbuck who says, we're whaling men, and that's a whale. What are we doing? Let's and then they all go after it, and it kills them. And
Right.
that so your point that we're made to kind of confront our own, the piece of this that is also in us. I think is true. Even my own feeling that at the beginning there's just something so beautiful and compelling about the world as it is, violent and horrific. That both of those things can be true at the same time is maybe the most provocative thing about the movie.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I think how this sort of connects to the Flannery
Yeah.
O'Connor is that there's a darkness in that film that is extremely vocal. Like Moby Dick, I think, is metaphorical more so than
Mhm.
straightforward in that sense. And you kind of it's like allegory, and we're talking about like repentance and Jonah and the whale, and
Yeah.
how to turn around and all of that stuff, deliverance, and there's all these big themes. But then Wise Blood, it's so like people's awfulness is like on their sleeve. Like there's
Yeah.
this almost refreshing shameless directness with just how awful everyone is vocally, not trying to hide anything. And then for our main character to just say, well, I'm making a church without Christ. Like, we're not going to have Christ anymore, and I'm starting my own church. It's just all so brazen. And so that's, I don't know, it has so much less nuance, but in a sense, it still is communicating something that you can feel, but maybe not put words to.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems as if Talkingham is the town, right? In Wise
Yeah.
Blood. Yeah. It just is a town of, you know, hustlers and grifters uh, and people suffering and people alone, and there's nothing but schemes. It just sort of feels that there's nothing but people in gorilla suits.
Hmm.
And
Literally. And yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it sort of, and even that desire to, well, I guess I better put on the gorilla suit. If that's the world in which we live, then I must become that. It sort of seems like part of what the movie wants to say about the human condition is that I read somewhere that Flannery O'Connor said part of that novel is about the inevitability of a religious sensibility, or the inevitability
Mm.
of of religion, that he tries to he tries to create this church without Christ and ends up becoming kind of an Old Testament figure almost.
By blinding himself, and then the whole thing about Harry Dean Stanton and the blindness and the faith, and then like how there is this, I think, probably my favorite aspect of the way that Huston does it is the scenes where people are random people, whether it's Brad's character or Harry Dean Stanton's, where they're on the street and they just start preaching, there is something very innate. I don't know if it's our makeup to be drawn to stories, but you are kind of longing for, like, you're glued to what they say, and there's a part of you that really wants to be told something that's transformational or something that you can grasp or take away. And so when they've got those crowds sort of forming, you get it, even though you're like, this guy is a salesman, he's full of it, he's just wanting money.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, it's got this power to it. It might just be the quality of her writing, but it does draw you in almost involuntarily. Like, I didn't choose to want to hear this. I'm just being almost enticed, or it's like spellbinding, because you're wanting that meaning so badly.
Yeah. Even in that moment at the beginning, the potato peeler salesman, where all the characters kind of converge for the first time, is around this guy, who's set up and is hawking these potato peelers for $1.50, and he, starts pointing to Enoch Emery, and Enoch Emery is just kind of, as if because he's been singled out, is sort of like, well, I guess I want one now. I get now the gaze has been turned to me, so now I want one, and they all have their kind of reactions to it, but it's as if they all want one in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
That Hazel buys one, and the girl, keep forgetting her name.
I know. I'm gonna have to look it up now.
It's Hawk's daughter. Her name is Sabbath.
I was about to say it's Sabbath because she explains the origin of her name, and her mom named her Sabbath because she was born on this Sunday.
Right,
yeah.
right. So Sabbath wants one, but doesn't have enough money to pay for it. Enoch doesn't have enough money to pay for it. Just that, that to your point, that we too kind of want something from these sermons. I had thought originally watching it that it was going in a direction like, you've seen Man in the Crowd, A Face in the Crowd.
Oh yeah, with Andy Griffith.
I thought it was. Mm-hmm. I sort of assumed it was going to go in that direction, where he's going to make this church, and we're going to watch this church sort of develop, and it'll kind of do whatever it does. But then it just doesn't do that at all. That's it very much denies us that. He just fails to establish any kind of church. We see him give one kind of well-attended sermon, and then the next time he does it, nobody's listening.
It's almost like the opposite of the apostle in that sense. I don't know if you've seen the Duvall movie, but where it's almost like the message I take from that is that insincerity doesn't work ultimately. He's not rewarded for the fact that he doesn't believe in anything.
Right.
And so there is no church because it's just empty words. He's just got nothing of substance to offer. Not to say people can't succeed if they have nothing of substance, but I like that he doesn't, because that's sort of the inference there.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Like, he's got nothing really to say other than that he's just against, mm-hmm. Like his entire, this is also so often true where, you get the feeling that people don't actually have opinions. They just have like they are defined by what they don't believe. As opposed to curating your own.
Yeah. Well, and that's sort of, I think that ties back to Moby Dick as well, that Ahab has defined himself in terms of his antagonist. He is just what the whale has made him into. And that is his kind of, to use a literary term, his tragic flaw. And I think that's true that he shares that with Hazel, that Hazel doesn't have. And Brad Dourif's, I feel like I say this so much I'm maybe lying or something, or I throw this into things I write on Letterboxd too much. It almost seems like I'm not telling the truth, but I don't normally care about acting that much. But
right, neither do I.
But Brad Dourif is great in Wise Blood. I think just there's this barely contained kind of rage at all times, that he just can hardly say anything without seeming as if he's about to tear somebody's head off.
Even when they're helping him, like with the car,
Right.
he's so irritated and aggressive.
Yeah.
That it's just like, I was just thinking when you were saying that, it's like he's really the Antichrist. Like he's the Antichrist in a sense, where he is trying to proclaim this without having any solution whatsoever, other than like, we're just not going to be like these people over here, and there's just really nothing to that at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you interpret his punishment as a result of that? Do you think that's why he comes to suffer?
But it's self-inflicted. Yeah. So you wonder if it's like, because obviously if you want to contrast the characters, Ahab, I don't know if you feel this way. I feel like he didn't learn a thing.
No.
Like there is no come to Jesus moment of clarity, sort of reckoning with anything, which is what the sermon was about, that Jonah was redeemed because in the belly of the whale, he said, in the sermon, in the Melville language, it says that he didn't pray for pardon. He understood that the punishment was just.
Right.
And then the preacher was saying, this is how you should repent, that you actually don't pray for pardon. You acknowledge that like you deserve this, and that's why God delivers him, right? So that's obviously the opposite of what happens to Ahab.
Right.
He doesn't get any better, and then he dies.
Right.
And with Hazel, I feel almost like his self-inflicted thing it's so self-absorbed because there's no sacrifice involved. He's not doing it for some sort of like greater good. So I don't even know that I know what that motivation is, but it seems incredibly selfish to me as opposed to heroic, or maybe he thinks that there's some sense of, he thinks that this will mean something, but I don't know. I get the impression that he's just like Ethan Hawke in First Reformed. He's literally just torturing himself.
Right. In place of belief.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that, it shares that quality with the ancient flagellants, or with certain, I've read about certain, Buddhist monks who do these kind of repetitive, painful tasks, as a sort of way of that this, denies the self, and by denying the self and by, kind of stripping away all these worldly pleasures, we can see the divine more clearly, that sort of concept. But it doesn't see, I feel like I'm not quite, there's a line of dialogue that's on the tip of my mind, but that I'm not going to remember, where he sort of makes that clear that that's not what he's trying to do.
Right.
With, when he's talking to the landlord, that he's just doing these things, even when he said, I'm busy, I've got too much to do, he's always gonna,
he doesn't have anything to do.
Right.
There's like a uselessness about the behavior and a self-obsession that's very strange, because I feel like there's a self-obsession that's hand in hand with self-loathing.
Yeah.
Like these people don't like themselves. And at least with Hazel, he's not, at the end, he's not trying to lead anybody like Ahab was.
Right.
It's just his own personal hell that he's in, and the fact that he doesn't marry the landlady also is just like, he doesn't care about his own nourishment or anything at all. Like, of course he's not going to do it for her, but the fact that he doesn't even do it for himself is very interesting.
Yeah. And all these kind of, symbolic things in that film, that borrow from these kind of, Sabbath dressed as Mary, but with the sort of perverted Christ, the shrunken body, the blinding and um, these self-flagellating acts, that,
And the barbed wire,
yeah,
or the, that he's sleeping and actually hurting himself, and he's got glass in his shoes.
right. That, it's sort of, I guess it suggests to me that it is borrowed from that, um, from that tradition, from that text, but that it's ultimately a, a hollow, assemblage of these acts, I guess. Did you feel, I read a few interesting, I think, takes on the film that that do tie it to, more to Flannery O'Connor's kind of particular Christian
Mm-hmm.
ethos than I felt it was. I felt it was not a film that came from a place of belief, I
Belief.
suppose. But what did you think about that?
I think that it comes from a place of maybe trying to depict and or empathize with the opposite
Mm-hmm.
side. Like, I think what strikes me about this is that it seems like a believer who's attempting to understand what people would be like who don't. Like, what would their psychology be like? What would the behavior be like? What would they be living for? What sort of things would they be questioning? Because I think Flannery sees it as inescapable that you have to grapple with these things, which Baldwin also wrote about, where it's like, you at some point, like, God is either, he said, God is either a personal agony or an abstract question,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't really just not deal with it, basically. And so this to me comes across as like, it has all these Christian themes and allusions, not ill, to it. So it's coming from a place of knowledge,
Right.
right? But I think she's not commentating on what it looks like to believe at all. I think she's like curious about what other people would act like, maybe.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think,
It's just my own personal take.
yeah, because Houston's Bible film is, I think, not a Christian film to my
Mm.
viewing of it. I would be interested to know what other people think about that. But they're that kind of genre of the biblical epic, mid-century biblical epic, Technicolor, Ben-Hur, all these,
Ten
yeah,
Commandments.
that I think are very much films of of belief, that are presenting you with a worldview, even if it's kind of ahistorical. Often this idea that, the history was just waiting for Christianity to come along and solve its problems. I think, that's sort of the argument, I feel like, of many of the biblical epics. But Houston's film, which kind of looks like that, I think just sort of shows those it allows those stories to just kind of exist as the strange poetic narratives that they are, and does kind of invite you to imagine them as real, in a
Mm-hmm.
particular way, um, to show you how this kind of, um, maybe influences our worldview now. That these are, in other words, what his Bible film is, and maybe that connects to these stories too, in the way he wants to frame them. These American literary, classics are part of what makes us who we are, as Americans, raised in these traditions, raised with these stories. This man locked in combat with God, as a whale. These, Noah, and these stories that many of us just growing up are surrounded by, or bombarded with. And that he kind of, I don't know, he seems to want us to see that reflected back at us, and ask ourselves, are these things true? Are these true of you? Are these true of us? Do we like how this makes us look? I don't know. I don't know if that's
I completely agree. No, and I think that you're also hitting on something, which is that he has these films that are very large scale, like us as a society, us as humanity, a big, big scope level look. And then you have films that are like very, very honed in. Night of the Iguana, Fat City is my favorite, but that one is very specific. Like we're only looking at 4
yeah.
people. So it seems like he's got this epic fascination with big questions and big ideas and big language like Shakespearean,
Mhm.
and then he focuses on, okay, in just day-to-day life for these people for whom life is very, very hard and they are lost and alcoholic and stuck. Um, you know, he's interested in both, I think, equally, maybe that there's still this searching regardless is, I guess, what I'm getting at, because that's definitely how I felt about Fat City, which is also based on a book, the Gardner book, but that's like it's about identity, and it's about just not being able to get out of your own way. And I don't know, he's just tackling so much, but at the end of
Mhm.
the day, he's got such a curiosity about him that I really like.
So that's your of all the Houston films you've seen, Fat City
Oh yeah.
is at the top. I gotta
Yes.
see it. I've not seen it.
I know. I got the well,
Nice.
this isn't Criterion, I wish it were, but I got the Blu-ray and the
Oh,
Gardner.
nice. Oh, that's a New
So
York Review books. Yeah, I love those. That's awesome.
it's a
I
beautiful
gotta
cover.
get that.
So I gotta rewatch it once I read the book. But that one to me was just it feels so personal. I think also because I read Houston was boxer for a certain period of time. So there's this, like, I don't know, it feels more like a love letter than I think perhaps the others do, because it's more familiar to him.
Yeah,
And Jeff Bridges and Stacey Keach are just
yeah,
fantastic. It's
yeah,
really, really good.
yeah.
I'll have to mail it to you, Jacob, if you can't find a
I'll
copy.
get it.
Yeah,
I'll
it's great.
I'll Russian website it if I have to.
I won't
I'm
tell
just
anybody.
kidding.
But yeah, so just to wrap up, I think yeah, I think we've come out on the side of that Houston's definitely a provocateur and provocateur. What do you think?
Definitely, yeah. And we didn't even talk, I had thought, made some notes about his, he worked as a propagandist. He was he was in
Oh,
the
yes.
American military machine for some time, and then ended up blacklisted and lived abroad for the, later part of his life. These kind of aspects of him, I do think, underline this idea that this is an artist who was shaped in and became very critical um, of the American experiment, and all, I think he shares that with maybe all of my favorite artists, that kind of willingness to look at, or all my favorite American artists, his willingness to look at this kind of uh, strange blood economy that we came from, and that has shaped us into what we are, makes him a really radical um, filmmaker.
Yeah, he does it. You just reminded me of Lynch in the way that, like, Lynch does that, but in a suburbia way,
Definitely.
I think. Whereas Houston it feels more world traveler.
Mm-hmm.
It seems vaster than Lynch's critiques of, like, the home, that you don't know the city that you live in,
Yeah,
or, your neighbor sort of thing. But this is just so much
yeah.
more, it feels all encompassing,
Mm-hmm.
universal, as opposed to just, but he does that individual level too. So I'm very grateful. I didn't know a lot beyond Maltese and Treasure of the Sierra
Sure.
Madre. So I feel like I'm a lot more well-rounded
Yeah,
now.
me too.
Yeah. So
Once I get
thank you very
once I get
much,
Fat
Jacob.
City on my, yeah,
Yes, then you'll
I'll
be
be
officially
okay. Cool.
Houstonized. Well, guys, wonderful first episode. I look forward to doing the series. Jacob, thank you so much.
Anytime.
and we'll see you at the movies.